はい、皆さん、こんにちは。特定非営利活動法人ダイヤモンド・フォー・ピースによるオンラインセミナー第3回紛争ダイヤモンドとキンバリープロセス、その意義と限界にご参加いただき誠にありがとうございます。このセミナーは4回シリーズのうち第3回目のセミナーになりまして、次回最後のウェビナーは11月7日土曜日、朝9時から1時間半程度を予定しております。こちらに関する詳細は本ウェビナーの最後にアナウンスさせていただきます。私はダイヤモンド・フォー・ピースリベリアで理事を務めております鈴木と申します。本日はどうぞよろしくお願いいたします。まず開始にあたりセミナーの進め方に関していくつか確認をさせてください。本日は Zoom ビデオウェビナーを利用して開催しております。皆様のビデオ、マイクはご利用いただけない設定にしておりますのでご了承ください。皆様の通信環境や接続状況によってセミナーの配信が途切れたり音声が聞き取りにくい可能性もございますので、ネットワーク環境の良い場所からご参加いただければと思います。本日のセミナーはただいまから9時半までの約1時間半を予定しております。講師はキンバリープロセス市民社会連合グローバルコーディネーター、またジンバブエ環境法協会副代表のシャミソ・ムチシさんと、インターナショナルピースインフォメーションサービス IPIGES 研究員のハンス・メルケトさんの2名です。シャミソ・ムティシさんは18年以上にわたり工業、農業、天然資源分野で活躍する弁護士であり、責任ある原料の調達、人権、ダイヤモンド採掘、採掘産業、知的財産権等の分野において研究やアドボカシーの実績が豊富です。ジンバブエやマラウイの国会議員への研修を含む採掘業界において国会が果たすべき監督機能について複数の論文も発表しております。現在はキンバリープロセス市民社会連合のグローバルコーディネーターとして世界中の紛争ダイヤモンドの取引をモニターしております。ハンス・メルケトさんはダイヤモンド採掘や取引に関する研究プログラムおよびキンバリープロセス市民社会連合における IPIS の業務をコーディネートしております。これまでにコンゴ民主共和国、タンザニアや中央アフリカ共和国での手掘り小規模採掘のマッピングや鉱山隣接地域における大規模採掘の影響等の調査を実施していました。IPIS はキンバリープロセス市民社会連合で唯一アフリカ外からのメンバーで、IPIS は天然資源、紛争マッピング、ビジネスと人権分野等における分析において、市民社会連合を支援しています。本日のプレゼンテーションですが、発表スライドには和訳をつけております。和訳のない、口頭のみのお話については、シャミソさんとハンスさんからのそれぞれの発表の後に、日本語で要点を説明いたします。全体で30分から40分のプレゼンテーションの後、日本語での補足説明、その後20分程度の質疑応答の時間を設ける予定です。今回はジンバブエとベルギーからご参加いただいておりますので、もしかしたら一部音声や映像が不安定になる可能性もありますが、ご理解いただけますと幸いです。もしセミナー中に何らかの不具合が生じた場合は、チャットよりすべてのパネリスト、こちら主催者のみに送られますが、こちらへお送りください。事務局のスタッフが対応いたします。セミナーの最後に質疑応答タイムを設けますが、ご質問は Zoom の Q&A にお寄せください。QA 機能は皆様がご覧になっている画面中央下にある QA というボタンをクリックすると、ボックスが現れますので、プレゼンテーションの最中にそちらへ質問を随時、記載して送信してください。時間の制約上、すべての質問に答えられない可能性がございますので、なるべく皆さんが聞きたい質問を講師へ質問できるように、挙げられた質問に対して、これは私も聞いてみたいという質問があれば、ぜひ、親指のいいねマークをタップしてください。いいねされた QA は、質問は数が多い順に自動的にソートされますので、いいねの多い質問を村上から、講師へ質問する形で進めさせていただきたいと思います。で、QA にご寄せいただく、言語は日本語、英語どちらでも構いません。また、本セミナーの録音・録画はご遠慮ください。 本日のセミナーは録画して期間限定で配信予定です。ネットワーク環境等でご視聴できない状況が生じても後でご視聴いただけます。また最後にアンケートのことについて先にお伝えさせていただきます。セミナーが終了して皆様が Zoom から退出された後に自動的にアンケートのページが開くように設定しておりますので、ぜひ終了後アンケートへのご協力をお願いいたします。それではですね、まず本セミナーの主催団体であるダイヤモンド・フォー・ピース代表理事の村上よりご挨拶を申し上げます。
皆様こんばんは。特定非営利活動法人ダイヤモンド・フォー・ピースで代表理事を務めております村上と申します。まず、はじめに、本団体、主催団体でございますので簡単に、ご紹介をさせていただければと思います。私たちは2014年の5月に、任意団体として活動を開始しまして、NPO 法人としては2015年の3月に横浜で、法人登記をいたしました。でその後、ダイヤモンド・フォー・ピース・リベリアの現地法人を翌年2016年11月に設立をいたしまして、今、西アフリカのリベリアと日本で活動をしております。で私たちが、目指す社会なんですけれども、ダイヤモンドが人道環境配慮の上採掘カット製造されることが当たり前の社会を目指して活動をしています。ミッションとしてはダイヤモンドのサプライチェーンにいる労働者の労働環境の改善と、社会的地位の向上を図ること、また、ダイヤモンド業界における取引が道徳的で公平になるように働きかけることということで、活動分野としては今右に表示されております、1番の啓発活動、こちらは、ダイヤモンド業界における問題ですとか課題というのを多くの方に知っていただいて、解決のために、アクションを起こしていただくように呼びかけること、それから、2つ目が自立支援ということで、今はリベリアなんですけれども、こちらで、採掘労働者の自立支援の活動を行っております。この2つがメインなんですけれども、緊急支援として活動の対象国で災害ですとか大きな、疾病が発生した場合には緊急支援を行っておりまして、例えば2014年からエボラ出血熱が西アフリカでありましたので、その時も支援を行いましたし、今年は新型COVID ですね、COVID-19 の支援ということで、衛生ツールの配布というのを現地で行ったりですとか、正しい手洗いの方法の啓発活動ですとかということを行っております。で私たちの当面の目標は、フェアなダイヤモンドを国際市場に流通させる仕組みを構築するということで、今リベリアにいる人々と一緒に、頑張っているところです。で、本日は、キンバリープロセス、ダイヤモンド業界では、キンバリープロセスといえば、一度は聞いたことがある方は多いかと思うんですけれども、あまり知られていないというのが実情でして、ただそれを、なるべく多くの方に正しい、情報を知っていただきたいということで、今回このセミナーを、主催することにいたしました。では次に、プレゼンターのお二人に登壇していただきましてお話をいただきたいと思います。で最後にですね、基本的にプレゼンテーションは英語なんですけれども、スライドに全ては訳がついておりまして、でその後に、日本語で補足の説明をさせていただきます。では、お二人の、発表者の方々よろしくお願いいたします。So please welcome Mr. Shamiso Mitisi.
Thank you very much, Chi. I hope everyone can hear me. I wanted to confirm if Chi, you can hear me.
Yeah,
and,
we can hear you. Yeah, clearly.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this very, very important event and session, which definitely for us as the Kimberley Process Civil Society Coalition is quite important in the sense that we are discussing how diamonds, instead of fueling conflict, can be a medium for promoting peace. And that's quite important. So Diamonds for Peace is an issue that we definitely think is important. Now I'll ask Chi to discuss the issue of the poll, but before I do that, I wanted to go back to, can you pardon me? My screen is acting up in terms of my presentation. Apologies for that. Chi, can you help me to go back to the first slide?
Just a moment.
Thank you. The first slide, please. The second slide after that. Thank you. So let me talk about the Kimberley Process Civil Society Coalition, which is basically the umbrella organization that acts as the observer of the Kimberley process on behalf of civil society. So most of the coalition members are based in Africa, and we are talking about diamond producing countries on the continent. And as the Kimberley Process Civil Society Coalition, we represent communities affected by diamond mining and trade. And our members strive to improve diamond governance in their home countries. And the coalition's local and regional expertise enables us to follow up on responsible diamond sourcing on the ground and articulate grassroots perspectives in the diamond mining sector at national, regional, and international fora. So the coalition includes membership from different countries in Africa, including Cameroon, Democratic Republic of Congo, Guinea, Ivory Coast, Liberia, Lesotho, Sierra Leone, Zimbabwe, and Belgium. So in Belgium, we have IPIS, which represents us there. That's in Europe. In terms of what I'm going to talk about today, it is about, can I get the second slide, please? So there's a questions that were asked in advance as part of the poll. I will ask Chi to lead on that. The question is there: what kind of diamond-related abuses do you think the Kimberley process seeks to stop? That's the question. I'm sure that question is quite important in shaping our discussions as well. Is it war on armed conflict? Is it human rights abuses? Is it rebel movements? Fighting governments? Or is it widespread or systematic violence? So I'm sure, Chi, you can talk more to the results as well.
Can you see the results? Show me so.
Yes. So, yes.
So, shall I explain?
Yes, please.
第、1つ目の投票の方は、キンバリープロセスはダイヤモンドに関するどのような問題に対処していると思いますかということで、4つの選択肢を、に答えていただきました。一番多かったのが人権侵害で 71% の方が選んでいただきまして、2番目が戦争や武力紛争 61% の方、3番目が反政府組織の政府に対する活動暴動が 32%、それから、4番目が広範囲にわたるもしくは組織的な暴力と答えてくださった方が 32%、複数回答ですので、このような結果になりました。Okay, go ahead.
Thank you very much. So, what is quite important? Hello, Chi. I seem to be having problems with my slides here.
Yes. You want to go back?
Yes, let's go back to
This one.
part 1. There are ongoing human rights abuses in diamond mining. And these ongoing human rights abuses are quite important for us to take note of. If you look at the slide there on the changing nature of conflict, what we are observing is that diamonds are now tainted by new forms of conflict and various types of actors committing human rights abuses. And these diamonds flow into and they are certified as free by the Kimberley process. If we go to the next slide, in terms of the changing nature of conflict, what we have observed is that violence is often widespread and systematic in the diamond mining sector. And this includes beatings, shootings, killings, and torture of artisanal miners. Across the continent, there are several examples of countries where this is happening. And Zimbabwe is just one example. We also have cases happening in Tanzania, Central African Republic, where we still have conflict diamonds as defined by the Kimberley processes, by the Kimberley process, when it comes to use of diamonds to buy arms for unseating legitimate governments. So Central African Republic, we still have that problem in terms of diamonds that are used by rebel movements. We also have, when it comes to cases of violence, DRC, there's some parts of DRC where violence is taking place, Angola, cases where violence is taking place. And then another form of abuses or the new conflicts, the new forms of conflicts that happen in the sector relates to sexual violence, including harassment, rape, abuse, and exploitation. And there are examples that already have been written about, whether in Tanzania, Central African Republic, and Zimbabwe. Another form of the changing nature and the conflicts in the diamond mining sector include environmental harm and crimes. So when we talk about environmental harm and crimes, we are talking about the soil, water, and air pollution, and even landscape destruction. And there are examples in Sierra Leone where some companies take away land, degrade the land, do not rehabilitate the land. And in Lesotho, for example, cases of water pollution have been reported and have been monitored. And that's an issue of concern. when it comes to Zimbabwe, just as a case study, the case of Marange, we have an area called Marange in Zimbabwe. Diamonds are mined in the eastern part of the country. If you know the map of Zimbabwe, it's there on my slides. The border with Mozambique. The diamonds in Marange mostly alluvial, which consist of sandy material and loose gravel. So in 2006 and 2007, there was a diamond rush in Marange, where the communities and people would go to Marange, use picks and shovels to get diamonds because they are alluvial, they are easy to get. So the area has got alluvial diamonds, and there are also conglomerates and kimberlites, although there is a lot of exploration that is still going on. But this is an area that is called the Mkondo series, which geographers definitely, or geologists would say, is about 1 billion years. However, diamond prospecting area in Marange jumped from 70,000 in terms of the area where diamonds are prospective or where they can be found, to about 120,000 hectares. The numbers may actually have multiplied as well in terms of where diamonds are prospective. But according to the Kimberley Process Working Group of Diamond Experts, Marange diamonds consist of approximately 10% gem and near gem quality diamonds and 90% industrial diamonds. So that means the footprint in terms of Marange diamonds is mostly 90% industrial diamonds, 10% gem quality, and 10% gem quality. So on average, Marange diamonds are around 4 carats per stone, but those numbers may vary sometimes. Now, the following slides that I want to show are taken and were picked in a report that we did as the Kimberley Process Civil Society Coalition from our studies and also studies by other organizations in Marange, in Lesotho, in Sierra Leone, and in Angola. So these pictures represent the new forms of conflicts or the new forms of violence that happen in the diamond mining sector. So if you do not wish to view these photos, please listen to the audio only, because these may be disturbing. So, but what is important for us to take note of is basically the new forms of violence that is not recognized in terms of the Kimberley process. My colleague later on will define what the KP or the Kimberley process says, defines as conflict diamonds. Now, what are the new forms in picture format? If you can look at those pictures, they show the changing nature of violence. They show artisanal miners being beaten by dogs and cases of violence. But these pictures, as you can see, they were taken in 2015, 2017. They are not current as such, but they show the nature of the problems in the diamond mining sector, the changing nature of conflicts. It's no longer about rebel movements. It's about state security, private security, beating up people and sometimes killing people. So those are there in our report. Real care is rare, and they show some of the problems in terms of the violence that happen in the sector. But like I said, these are archival pictures. They were not taken yesterday or day before yesterday. Now, again, when it comes to the changing nature of conflicts and human rights in the diamond mining sector, if you go to the other slide, you will find that there are poor labor standards by mining companies. It shows that mining companies themselves are involved in terms of creating conditions that are not conducive to the rights of workers. And this even includes manufacturing centers. And this has been further aggravated by COVID-19, because if you look at the restrictions related to COVID-19, they limit freedoms. They limit movement of people. And as a result, the rights of workers, even at the mine place, have been affected. Some companies may not even be providing enough personal protective equipment for the workers. So this exposes the workers themselves to contracting COVID-19. So this does not just happen in Zimbabwe, but in other countries as well. Take, for example, India, poor labor standards in the cutting and polishing industries in India. And this has been documented. Then the other example in terms of human rights challenges and violations that we have seen are the harms to livelihoods in numerous forms. Restrictions on the movement and freedom of movement, where huge diamond mining concessions are declared as protected areas. And then you have the state security or the private security putting in place unreasonable measures to restrict movement. For example, in Zimbabwe, you cannot just go in to a mining concession without a permit. So villagers who live inside the mining concession have to constantly produce a permit. If you are driving, you have to produce a permit. And this is restricting movement for the villagers. And in some cases, you're asked for your identity document. So the villagers are asked for identity documents. So this definitely limits freedom of movement in the concessions. And then we also have a situation where the displacement or relocation of communities is ill-managed. Sometimes they are not given adequate compensation. Sometimes they are not given adequate notice when they are removed from their traditional homes into another area. And in those areas where they are relocated, they are not provided with adequate social services like access to water, electricity, farming land, land for livestock, and other basic needs. Yet they would have been removed from their traditional homes. So this is affecting communities. Those are the new forms of human rights violations in the diamond mining sector. So if we can go to the next slide there, we have a situation where there's also harm to livelihoods, definitely, just like I indicated, with pollution of water, with land grabbing by diamond mining companies and deviation of water sources. And this is affecting farmland, this is affecting livestock, and even water for drinking. In 2012, for example, in Zimbabwe, 2 rivers were polluted by a Chinese mining company called Anjin. They were discharging raw effluent into a river system, and that affected water and access to water for the communities. Besides Zimbabwe, Lesotho, the same thing, water being polluted. All these rights violations and problems lead to poverty in the communities. So with numerous consequences, food insecurity, health problems, increased tensions, violence, school dropouts, child labor, and so forth and so on. And these are being aggravated by COVID-19. So these are things that are happening in the diamond mining sector. Just some additional pictures there. If you can go to those pictures, we have dwellings that were alleged to have been damaged by mine blast from Letseng mine. That's in Lesotho. Then women queuing for recycled water in a village in Lesotho as well. And the mine tailings and dump truck that were abandoned at a local community water source and later removed and discarded. So these are the kind of abuses, these are the kind of conflicts that happen in the diamond mining sector. If you can go to the next slide. In terms of if you look at it again in terms of labor standards, in India, for example, we are saying first there were blood diamonds. If you look at that report from Thomson Reuters Foundation, first there were blood diamonds. In India, they are suicide diamonds. And that's based on investigations. So that picture and that caption tells a story of a situation where the working environment is not conducive. The rights of the workers are not being protected and promoted in the diamond supply chain from the mining countries to the polishing and cutting countries. So those are issues that, as the Kimberley Process Civil Society Coalition, we are concerned about. Now, who are the actors? Who are the actors? I'm sure some of you will be asking. So who is doing this? There are various kinds of perpetrators. There are various kinds of perpetrators. The first, for example, when it comes to violence, when it comes to beatings, it's the non-state armed groups. Maybe not necessarily just rebel groups, because we said in terms of rebel groups, we have Central African Republic. But in the other countries, there are non-state armed groups that exist, that are there, that have taken control of certain trade routes in the diamond sector. Then we also have state security. It might be the police, it might be the military. So this is happening in different countries. So you have a situation where state security is involved in human rights violations. You also have a situation where some companies would hire private security to protect their premises or their property. And those private security companies or individuals who are hired as internal security end up committing human rights violations. So private security is also another actor. Then there are also gangs. Sometimes even artisanal miners themselves killing each other, beating up each other. So these are all different actors that we are talking about in terms of the violence that go on in the diamond mining sector. So for the Kimberley process, one of the key things is to look at company responsibility, because if we have different perpetrators, and we have just talked about private security, armed security, state security, and so forth, but the companies themselves sometimes end up violating human rights. Take, for example, the issue of environmental harm, labor rights violations, and harms to the livelihoods. Large-scale mining companies can contribute to that. They are the ones who may pollute the rivers. They are the ones who may degrade the environment. So these companies might be state-owned companies, and sometimes multinational companies or joint venture companies. It might also happen in manufacturing centers. And then you also have a situation where artisanal miners and small-scale miners might be involved. So you have a set of new actors, and these new actors are not per se provided for in terms of responsibility in the Kimberley process definition of conflict diamonds. However, the Kimberley process places a duty on the industry to come up with a system, a voluntary system a system of warranties. And I think that places responsibility on diamond mining companies. And WDC, the World Diamond Council, has developed their system of warranties, which definitely, if implemented well, and if it can be refined, can definitely help in terms of promoting responsible sourcing. So WDC is doing something about that. Now, having said that, I think the other element that is quite important for us, that is a major vulnerability in the Kimberley process or in the diamond supply chain, is that diamonds are an easy vehicle for money laundering and for the activities of criminals and even terrorist financing. And that was pointed out in a report by the Financial Action Task Force. This report was produced in 2013. It was shared with the Kimberley process. That report points out the vulnerabilities of the diamond mining sector in contributing to illicit financial flows, money laundering, used by criminals, and even terrorist financing. So it's important for the diamond industry across the chain to be aware of this and to assess the vulnerabilities. So what I would do now is I will let my colleague Hans Meckert talk about what the Kimberley process is doing about this. And I'm sure he will be able also to fill in the gaps from my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shamiso. I hope you can all hear me. So now, Shamiso has given a really good overview of what kind of problems, human rights abuses still exist in the diamond sector to date. And it might surprise you, I guess, that none of the abuses that Shamiso talked about is being addressed by the Kimberley process. And even worse, these abuses, diamonds that are subject to these abuses, receive a conflict-free certificate from the Kimberley process. And to understand how that can be and why that is the case, I'll take you a bit through what the Kimberley process is and what it does and doesn't do. So I would like to go to the next slide. And now a poll will come up, but I guess I can continue also. So the question is, what percentage of rough diamonds are conflict-free according to the Kimberley process? So you have seen all these kinds of abuses that exist. The Kimberley process publishes a figure on its website of the percentage of diamonds that are, in its view, conflict-free. And the question is, what do you think that figure would be? I'll pick up on the results of the first poll also later on in my presentation. I'll do the same with this one. It will come back a bit later, but feel free to reply already. Okay, so interestingly, most of you, let's see, think it is 60%. Followed by 85. So we'll get back to that later. I'd like to go to the next slide. I think we missed the slide. Is that possible? Can you go back to the previous one? There's a slide about the origin of the. Yeah, well, that's the one I was looking for. Thank you. So yeah, I think it's important to understand what the KP is to see where it comes from. So the origins lie, in fact, somewhere in the late 1990s, when a number of international NGOs started reporting about a link between diamonds and conflicts in countries like Angola and Sierra Leone. That actually these diamonds were fueling the conflict because rebel movements were using them to finance their activities. That was recognized in 2000 by the United Nations. And in that same year, there was a first meeting in Kimberley, which is an important diamond mining town in South Africa, where a number of important diamond producing and trading countries met with industry and with civil society. And that a whole sequence of meetings followed on that, and that became known, that this process became known as the Kimberley process. Already in the early days, the idea of a certification scheme for diamonds was introduced, but eventually negotiations on how that should look like were really complicated and tough, and it took 3 years before that certification scheme could be launched, which was in 2003. So you can go to the next slide, please. I won't go into all the details here. So I'll talk a bit more about the certification scheme later, but already just to understand what the KP is, it operates under the umbrella of the United Nations. So this means that actually the chair of the Kimberley process, which is on a rotating basis, participating countries can take the chairmanship. They report to the UN annually, and the UN gives the KP a mandate, but it is an autonomous process. So it can decide on how it implements its mandate and how which direction it wants to take autonomously, but under the umbrella of the United Nations. So the Kimberley process today has 55 participants, and these represent 82 countries. Now the difference between those two numbers is because the European Union, which represents 28 member states, they act as a single participant in the Kimberley process. Now these 82 countries, these span across the globe. It includes important mining countries in Africa, but also Russia, Australia, Canada, important trading countries like Belgium, where you have the important hub in Antwerp, the United Arab Emirates, China, Israel, Lebanon, and important consumer markets as there are the US, but of course also Japan. So the KP is a tripartite arrangement. That means that you have, besides these governments, you have representatives from industry and civil society acting as observers. Now these two groups are united in a coalition. So you have the civil society coalition, of which Chamisso and I are a member, and the industry coalition is the World Diamond Council in the KP. Now only member states, countries have decision-making powers. So the observers, they can participate in all discussions, they can advise, they can take the floor, but when decisions have to be taken, this relies purely on countries, which are also the only ones that have legal obligations under this system. So there are no legal obligations for industry and civil society participating in this only, but I'll come back to that later, how this is translated into domestic legislations. To the next slide, please. So the certification scheme, which is the key mechanism that the Kimberley process operates. In essence, it can be summarized very quickly. It is more complicated than that, but it applies to rough diamonds. So this is already a first important remark to make. So it doesn't apply to polished diamonds. And so the two basic conditions are, first, rough diamonds can only be traded between member countries. So it is illegal for any member to trade with a non-member, to trade rough diamonds with a non-member country. And every import and export of rough diamonds has to be accompanied by a government-issued conflict-free certificate. And it's important. I'll come back to that later. And Chamisso has already mentioned it. But conflict-free has a very specific definition in the KP, and this is one of the areas where, in our view, and in the view of many others who are watching this process, the Kimberley process falls short. So conflict diamonds are, by the KP, have always been, the past 20 years, defined as rough diamonds that are used by rebel movements to finance their attempts to overthrow legitimate governments. So this is really about rebel activity against elected governments. This is how the KP defines conflict diamonds. None of the other abuses that Chamisso presented fall under that definition. I'll come back to that also a bit later. Important to note that participation in the Kimberley process is voluntary, so you cannot, no country can be forced to participate, but if you want to trade with members, you have to be part of it. And if you become a member, it becomes legally binding in a way, because you have to implement a series of minimum requirements into domestic legislation. And this becomes a bit more complex, but I'll try to make it simple. If you go to the next slide, you'll see what these minimum requirements are. So here they are. I already said it, members can only trade among each other. And so every export or import of diamonds has to be done in a tamper-resistant container accompanied by a KP certificate. Each participant must appoint an importing or exporting authority, and they must pass legislation enshrining the KP standards in national law. And these standards, so that are these minimum requirements, they include internal controls that enable the government to track diamonds that are offered for export back to the place where they are mined or where they were imported. So this is often referred to under the name of traceability. And secondly, participants must submit on an annual basis reports, including statistical data, to the KP. And finally, participants are encouraged, note the rather non-committal language, of course, to invite review teams to verify compliance with KP CSC standards. I'll talk later also a bit about these review teams. You can go to the next slide, which is basically a visualization of what I have just said, how the Kimberley process presents it on its website. So you can go to the next slide. So the Kimberley process has been operating for 20 years this year, with 17 years of its certification scheme. What has it accomplished? Because we are, of course, critical of the Kimberley process, but we also want to acknowledge its achievements. And that is, first of all, that it has brought large volumes of diamonds into the legal trade. So diamonds that were formerly illegally traded or on the black market are now part of the legal trade. And importantly, that also means for instance, producer countries in the South, that this has increased their revenues because they can now levy taxes and royalties on these stones. Secondly, I talked about these minimum requirements. So that means that in every participating country, there is basic legislation in place and a governance structure. In essence, every country has to appoint a KP focal point, and that is your counterpart for anything that concerns the trade in rough diamonds, which is something you don't have for other minerals, of course, that if there's a problem, you know immediately who to talk to. Secondly, there's important cases of capacity building and technical assistance. So this can be in the form of training for law enforcement officers on issues of smuggling, on formalization of artisanal mining. This is not necessarily or even often done by the Kimberley process itself, which doesn't have any budget to do these kind of activities, but donors like the US, the EU, they use this structure, this framework, in order to implement projects that build on, that provides assistance building on the KP framework. And finally, importantly, there's increased reporting on statistical data of diamond production and trade. So also for you, for instance, if you want to know more about Japan's trade in rough diamonds, you can go to the Kimberley process website and you can find how many KP certificates it has issued last year and which volumes it has traded at which price. Only summary data is publicly available. You don't find there from which countries they are importing or exporting, but you find the general figures on the website. You can go to the next slide, please. So how then, if I said at the beginning of my presentation, is that the KP is failing in its mission to stop blood diamonds or conflict diamonds from reaching international markets, what is the explanation for this? And then in our view, there's a number of functional shortcomings of the KP. These are not new, they have been known for years. There have been every 5 years, the KP does a cycle of reform and review, but it has continued to failing to address these problems. And what is often referred to is the conflict diamond definition. I'll come back to that, but I want to make really clear here that that is only one of the concerns. There's a longer list. So firstly, I've talked about these internal controls that should allow countries to track diamonds that pass through their territory from the point where they're mined or imported to the export. Now, the KP doesn't have clear standards on how member states should do that. They have a list of recommendations of what member states could do. And this means that there's a patchwork of internal controls in both, for instance, producing countries and trading countries. First, let me talk a bit about producing countries. The implementation of these internal controls is weakest often in those states that are already quite prone to abuses and conflict. That can be through limited resources. It can be because their control systems are not well designed, or also because, of course, of issues of corruption of certain individuals that deliberately look away. And this means that when diamonds in many of these producer countries, particularly those with artisanal mining, when they arrive at the point of export, which is typically the capital city or another big city, it is often, authorities don't know very well where these diamonds came from which mining area in the country, or even it might be they might have been smuggled across the border from another country, but there's no ways to check these, or in many countries this is at least problematic. Also, these countries often don't have an incentive to stop smuggling, because in this way they can put these diamonds on their own production figures and they can increase their revenues through taxation in that way. And the same goes for trading centers. So in essence, they should also have internal controls in place that stop diamonds that have escaped controls in the producing country. But also here, the guidance by the KP is quite general, leading to variable implementation. You have, for instance, a center like Antwerp that is known for its strictest controls, but many others have been reported to be more or less well regulated. And there are, for instance, reports from centers like Mumbai or Dubai where diamonds, undocumented diamonds, would be mingled in legal production and so on. So that is a first very important shortcoming. Secondly, there's the issue of peer review. So this basically means that members of the KP are checking each other. This goes through review visits. I mentioned it. Members are supposed to invite a review visit every 3 years. It doesn't always happen. There can be review missions. That's different. That's for serious cases of incompliance, but these are rare. And there's the annual reporting, statistical reporting. So all this is reviewed by members, but the quality is diverse. It depends basically on the individuals involved, and often also the timeliness of these reviews. It can take many years before they are finally out. And basically, it's only recommendations are possible. So you can make recommendations, but there's no independent authority of the Kimberley process checking on any of this. And mainly when there are recommendations, there is no follow-up of them. So nobody is really checking whether participants are adapting their systems based on recommendations that have been made in the past. Thirdly, and I'll speed up a bit because I'm also aware of time, of course, the KP is based on consensus decision-making. So this basically means that any member can veto a decision. And this makes sure that even small decisions often take years, and really the bigger decisions, they never happen. And that's when I talk about issues of reform. There have been many attempts in the past, but it is so hard to make all these 55 members agree that in the end, often nothing happens. There's fourthly, a lack of transparency. This has improved a bit. So normally you should be able to view the annual reports of members, or the review visit reports on the KP website. Now, I've checked it before the webinar. I could only find, for instance, 7 review visit reports for the past 15 years. So there's still something definitely wrong there. And basically, there's many participants stick to confidentiality of meetings. So as a civil society coalition, we are allowed to observe these meetings, but we cannot talk about positions that have been taken in these meetings. And that, of course, alienates the public from this process. And it also creates the feeling that these participants would have something to hide from the public. Then we have the mixing gap. So basically diamonds, before they reach a consumer, so from mine to market, let's say, they tend to change hands many times, 5, 10 times. They go from one country to the next. They are traded with Antwerp. They go to Dubai, back to Antwerp, to many different directions. And that is mainly because actors in the diamond sector tend to specialize in diamonds with certain features based on the so-called 4 C's, which you may have heard of. This is carat, clarity, cut, and color. And in order to combine diamonds with the same features, often different parcels from different countries, they are opened, they are mixed, and new packages of diamonds are created. And this is also facilitated by the Kimberley process, because trading centers, they can issue certificates of mixed origin. So from the moment you combine diamonds from 2 different countries in a new parcel, you give a mixed certificate, and every trace of previous transactions or the origin of diamonds is lost. So for many diamonds, by the time they reach a consumer, you don't know anymore where they originally came from, which is of course very hard if you are trying to stop conflict diamonds or diamonds from certain problematic areas. A similar gap is with cutting and polishing. I already said the Kimberley process only applies to rough diamonds. So also here it is a consequence of how the KP is designed, but it is also something that is open to abuse. So people who want to hide or who want to escape Kimberley process controls, they can simply subject diamonds to manufacturing in order to make sure that the Kimberley process no longer applies. There are reports of some producing countries installing polishing centers for that purpose in order to escape controls. And also there are reports of a black market of undocumented stones that are sold for discounted prices in certain manufacturing centers. Then there's the issue of the narrow conflict diamond definition. I already said it, it only applies to rebel movements financing their activities through diamonds to fight government. So none of the other abuses, violence, torture, or violence by the army, by the police, by private security forces, child labor, environmental crimes, none of these issues falls under the scope of the Kimberley process. The Kimberley process only looks at rebel movements, which is and today that the only country where the Kimberley process identifies conflict diamonds is the Central African Republic. All other countries, they can export diamonds at will, no matter what the conditions or issues of violence that occurred with their mining or trading or manufacturing. And related to that is the human rights taboo. So this is something that is not talked about in the Kimberley process. It is defined as a conflict prevention scheme, so everything has to be framed around conflict. So to come back to the first poll that was issued, I think most of you, 71%, thought that the Kimberley process was addressing human rights abuses. It definitely isn't. The moment that even this is suggested, people will always, participants, they will refer to other fora in the United Nations, for instance, designed to address human rights abuses, but the Kimberley process does not want to deal with this. And finally, there's the issue of embargo. So basically, the Kimberley process has only one measure it can take when it defines conflict diamonds, and it's imposing a nationwide embargo. This is a very heavy measure, of course, and that means that it is not often triggered. So as I said, currently only in the Central African Republic. But also these embargoes tend to be really counterproductive. The victims are often communities whose livelihoods depend on diamonds. And often those criminal actors that are specialized in smuggling or illicit financing, they thrive precisely under such circumstances. So the Kimberley process does not allow to, for instance, stop certifying diamonds from one specific company or one specific mine that has been problematic. No, it is always on a nationwide level. In the Central African Republic, an exception has now been made. So there's a nationwide embargo, but there's a number of compliance zones from which it is allowed to export. I'd like to go to the next slide, please. This is just an illustration of what I have been saying. You see on the top, it's only a very small part of the abuses. So what the KP conflict diamond is only refers only to a very small part of all the abuses that exist, and it doesn't address issues of environment, human rights, development. Also, the more positive impacts, developmental impact, is something that is talked about in KP4A, but where no concrete measures are taken to address this. The next slide, please. So all of these problems that Shamiso has explained, that I've been talking about, they are not necessarily exceptional. You will hear similar stories if you look at gold mining, for instance. But what is quite exceptional for diamonds is the denial of these problems out of a fear for tainting this very image-sensitive industry. When you look, for instance, at the KP website, and this refers to the second poll that was done, you see, sorry, the figure the KP often circulates and is picked up by many in the industry is that thanks to the Kimberley process, 99.8% of diamonds are conflict-free. That is, of course, only by the KP's very narrow definition of conflict. And such statements are problematic because it gives the idea that the work is over. You had civil wars in the early 2000s. The KP has stopped these. You currently only have the situation in the Central African Republic. So it takes away all incentive for reform. And that is also why the past 20 years, any major issue of reform has failed. And we think those statements are quite problematic because they keep the KP blind to its inefficiencies, and they also don't recognize the situations that Shamiso has described, and meaning that there's no willingness to address these. Can you go to the next slide, please? So this is, for instance, this is a press release we issued that has been translated, thanks to Diamonds for Peace, to Japanese as well, that we issued in November last year, after the plenary where the reform cycle ended, and where actually there was a minor progress booked on the issue of peer review. I've talked about that, so some improvements have been made there, but the work that was done on trying to reform, for instance, this definition has failed. And this is not the first time that this happens. This has happened several times in the past as well. Can you please go to the next slide? And then I'm nearly at the end. I'm aware that we're going a bit over the time that was allocated for this presentation. But now maybe the way forward. So what needs to be done? There's of course no easy solutions to address these problems. And it's impossible to go to a fully responsible diamond supply chain overnight. But step by step, there's a need to go for progressive improvement. And this is also language that is defined in the OECD due diligence guidance for responsible sourcing of minerals. I've seen also that Diamonds for Peace is a member of the CSO group working on these issues of the OECD. And that is something that this step-by-step improvement is absent from the Kimberley process framework that operates in a very black and white manner. Either you have conflict diamonds, then you impose an embargo, or you have no conflict diamonds and you do nothing. But there's a need to change the mindset on this and to try and introduce more of this progressive improvement initiative. And in our view, the first step is to face the facts. So there has to be an acknowledgement that the work is not over, that there are problems. Even this is not, the majority of diamonds may be clean, may be responsible, but there's still an important part of the sector where there are problems and that need to be addressed. And so, of course, also in an important diamond consumption markets like Japan, we think it's important for citizens, consumers, jewelers to ask the difficult questions from their suppliers about diamonds. So ask, what assurances can you offer that these diamonds are responsible or ethical? And when the answer is only a KP certificate, I hope we have made clear now that that shouldn't be enough, that you need to ask for more guarantees, even though the answers might be disappointing, there might be little assurances, but we think it's important at least that these questions are asked, because only in that manner can we build pressure on industry and government to take new steps to make people aware that the Kimberley process isn't something that is cast in stone and that is finished, but that there's a need for more progress on this topic. And then please to the next slide, I think it's the final one. How can this look like? And for us, we think the KP has a role to play. If it doesn't reform, that role is quite limited. It refers to addressing situations where rebels are fighting governments through proceeds from diamonds as it exists in the Central African Republic. And even there, the KP is currently not being very effective because, for instance, there is an embargo on CAR, on the Central African Republic. But reports show that 95% of diamonds from that country are still smuggled out despite this embargo. So what is needed then besides this? So the KP can't be the only system addressing diamonds if it doesn't reform. And so other initiatives are needed to tackle all these other challenges that are not being addressed currently by the Kimberley process. And these, some exist today. There are traceability initiatives, for instance, from big industrial mines working through blockchain to show customers where these diamonds have come from mine to market. This is for De Beers, for instance, has such a system. There are responsible sourcing programs where artisanal miners are offered a framework and the situation is monitored and guarantees are offered to consumers that these diamonds, that the artisanal diamonds are responsibly sourced. There's an initiative in Sierra Leone by GemFair. There's also the Antwerp Diamond Council has an initiative in Guinea. These are quite small pilots. There's industry self-regulation. Chamiso has mentioned it. It exists in various forms. WDC indeed has its, the World Diamond Council has its system of warranties. There are certain big diamond retailers that ask certain guarantees from their suppliers about policies they should implement or documents they should provide. We think there's quite some room for improvement still here because there aren't strong audits really of the whole supply chain to monitor human rights issues along that supply chain. But we think all of this, all these small or bigger initiatives, there are best practices in there, but there hasn't been a lot of discussion on how this can be improved, how these gaps of the KP can be filled, how these can be scaled to the sector as a whole, because of the fact that there's not often, there's little awareness about the problem. So we think it's important to discuss how we can build further on the existing initiatives outside of the Kimberley process as well. And I think there's no further slide, if I'm right. And that would also be the end of my presentation. A poll will come up now. And I guess we also, Chi will take the floor to make some clarifications about issues that might not have been clear to Japanese. This is now a personal question for all of you. What do you think should diamond consumers, retailers do, knowing all of this that we have been prevented? Should they do nothing? It's not their responsibility. Should they stop buying diamonds? Should they only buy diamonds from countries with no reported abuses? Or should they ask assurances from jewelers about the conditions in which diamonds were mined? So I thank you very much for your attention. I think we will also have some time to answer some of your questions. I hope we have managed to make a quite complex topic at least a bit clearer to all of you. So that's an assuring answer that our message came across, because that was indeed also how we see the way forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your informative presentation. I will make some supplementary explanation. では皆様が質問などを書いている間に、私の方で簡単に、補足説明の方をさせていただければと思います。で基本的にプレゼンテーションはこのスライドに、のっとって行われましたので、スライドに書かれていない説明について、簡単に、補足をさせていただきます。まずジンバブエの、マランゲ鉱山、非常に有名な大規模かつ、いろいろな人権侵害が起こっているということで有名なんですけれども、ここの、ダイヤモンド鉱山の、地質学的な状況なんですけれども、ダイヤモンドの鉱山というのは主に2種類に分かれるんですけれども、アルービアルと言われる表層部分を掘るダイヤモンド採掘と、あとは、地下を掘る2種類があるんですが、マランゲ鉱山の方は表層の方ですね、を掘るような、形になっています。ですので、 ここに、ダイヤモンドラッシュということで一時期人が殺到したそうです。で、その後ですね、その前か、すいません。この紛争の性質の変化というところが、非常に重要でしたが、その紛争というのはその戦争だったり内戦というのが、以前はそうだったんですけれども、今は紛争というのはそれだけではなくて、いろいろなものを含むものであるというのが、シャミソさんからの説明でした。例えばその暴力であったり虐待であったりとか、そういうことですね。で、写真の方は少し、古いんですけれども、そういった、変わりゆく性質を表しているものということです。で、特に、こういったさまざまな課題があるんですけれども、今ちょうどその新型コロナウイルスでいろいろな、移動の自由などが制限されているので、その状況がさらに悪化しているという、説明がされました。で、またこの環境の、環境破壊の話が、あったと思うんですけれども、こちらですね。この時にそのジンバブエの例としては、2つの川がその中国企業ですね、中国系の、ダイヤモンド採掘企業のアンジンというところによって汚染されてしまったというお話がありました。でまた、このような問題というのはその採掘をしている国だけではなくて、インドのような、研磨ですとかカットをしている国にあっても、人権侵害という問題は起こっているということです。で次にハンスさんからの、プレゼンテーションだったんですけれども、先ほど、一番最初に投票で皆さんに、キンバリープロセスがどのような問題に対処していると思いますかというところで、人権問題というのが、かなり、多くの方が入れていただいたんですけれども、実はそういったことというのはこのキンバリープロセスというのは対象にしていないですね。で、定義が非常に狭いというお話が、ありまして、その定義というのは、プレゼンテーションではっきりとは書いてなかったですけれども、お話の中でですね、反政府軍が正規の政府を倒すためにの、活動ですね、暴力であるとか暴動であるとか、内戦であるとかという活動に使うための資金としてダイヤモンドを使うというのが紛争ダイヤモンド、コンフリクトダイヤモンドの定義になります。ですので、それ以外のことはキンバリープロセスは一切関与していないということですね。それから、ここで少し、説明がありましたのでちょっと見ていきますと、この不完全な国内管理のところなんですけれども、特に生産国、アフリカの国が多いのでなかなかその管理のシステムがうまく設計されていないというのもありますし、施行するというのにも問題がありますし、汚職の問題もあるということで、アフリカ以外です。例えばそのアントワープは厳しいコントロールで有名なんですけれども、それ以外の国ではほとんどきちんと管理ができていないというようなことがあるということをおっしゃっていました。でまたそのレビューミッションという、その評価のための、キンバリープロセスから派遣されるミッションというのも3年ごとに行うはずなんですけれども、3カ国同士で行うので、その内容ですとか質というのはその実施する人にも完全に委ねられてしまっているということで、何か提案をしてもそれがフォローアップされたりとかやったかというのを確認することもないので、そのままになってしまっているということですね。で意思決定につきましては、キンバリープロセスの場合は3カ国すべてが同意しないと採択をしないということになっていますので、なかなかその大きなことを採択するというのはできない。1カ国反対すればもうそれは採択しないということになってしまうという、ところに課題があるということですね。 それから透明性に関しても、現在、キンバリープロセスのウェブサイトに載っているレビューの報告書というのは7つしか、なかったということですね。で次の、すいません、この課題の混同というちょっと日本語が、誤りがありましたので、訂正させていただきますと、このミクシングというのは、原産国、ダイヤモンドの原産国が混ざってしまうということの、問題のことをおっしゃっていました。というのはそのダイヤモンドがいろいろな国で採掘をされて、トレーディングセンターと言われる、販売をする国、例えばベルギーであるとかインドであるとかイスラエルであるとかにこう運ばれるんですけれども、そこでもうダイヤモンドの質ですとか大きさなどによってこう混ざってしまう。で混ぜられてもそのトレーニングセンターの国というのは、複数の国から来てますよという、こう証明書を出せばいいので、もうそのままになってしまうというお話ですね。で紛争ダイヤモンドがこう紛れ込んでいて、その販売されている国で安く売られているようなケースもあるということでした。で金融措置の限界につきましては、金融措置がこのキンバリープロセスが取れる唯一の手段なんですけれども、結局その金融措置をしたところで一番の被害者は日々の食料をこう得るために働いている現場の人々というのと、またその金融措置というのは1カ国単位で行わなくてはいけないので、その問題がある一鉱山とか一企業の操業を止めるということはできないということですね。でその現在のキンバリープロセスの定義に当てはまる国というのは、中央アフリカ共和国しかないですけれども、でもちろんそこは今金融措置が取られていますが、結局その中央アフリカ共和国で採掘されるダイヤモンドの 95% は密輸されて、流通しているというようなお話でした。で、今後の、話なんですが、これは、日本語の記事もあるのでご覧いただきたいんですが、そのキンバリープロセスの紛争ダイヤモンドの定義が狭いので、それを変えようという提案も時々なされるんですが、前回、去年もそうですが採択はされなかったということですね。で例えばその、今後の話でキンバリープロセス以外のこうイニシアチブをこう盛り上げていく必要があるということで、一つのツールの例としては OECD が発行しているデューデリジェンスガイダンスっていうのがあるんですけれども、そういったものをもとにして、デューデリジェンス、評価ですねを行っていくというのも重要であるというお話と、でした。で例えばその消費者の方とか、がいろいろお店で質問をするということが、重要なんですけれども、そのキンバリープロセスの証明書をもしそこで見せられたとしてもそれだけでは、不十分であるというのが今日のお話でご理解いただけたと思います。では簡単ですけれども私からの補足説明とさせていただきます。
はい、ありがとうございます。では続々とQA の方にたくさん質問を、していただいているんですけれども、ちょっとチャットでも流しましたが、いいねをが多い順からちょっと回答させていただきたいと思っていますので、今ちょっと10秒くらい待ちますので、ぜひこれも聞いてみたいというものがあれば、ぜひいいねを押していただければと思います。また何か追加で質問があれば、ここにまた書いていただいて、時間の許す限り回答できればと思います。日本語、英語どちらでも構いません。よろしくお願いします。はい。では、はい、そうですね。いくつかまたいいねを押していただいているので、じゃあちょっとまずはいいねが多い順から順に回答させていただければと思います。
Shamisa and Hans,
ヒデさん、
I'm
1
going
番目の
to
質問から。
ask you the questions with the most likes. Are you ready for that?
Yeah, sure.
So the first question with the most
Yes.
like is, can you tell us if there's any way to tell that diamond I'm going to buy is conflict-free or not at the shop?
Yeah, I can have a first go. Shamisa, you'll see where you can add. So unfortunately, unless if you define conflict as narrow as the KP does, then you could rely on a KP certificate. But if you want to be sure that it has not been subject to any of the abuses we mentioned, there are little guarantees. What some jewelers would do is only sell diamonds from countries with no known abuses, like Australian diamonds or Canadian diamonds. The downside is, of course, that thereby you risk to stigmatize a lot of, for instance, the African diamonds that are responsibly mined, but where you cannot have any guarantee. So there's a few smaller programs, such as Gem Fair Diamonds or Origini, which is the Antwerp World Diamonds Center project, that and you have My Fair Diamond as well. So there's a few very small brands that could do this. I'm not sure to what extent these are available in Japan, but the disappointing answer is that it's quite limited to be entirely sure about a diamond not being subject to conflict. Shamiso, I don't know, do you want to add something to that?
So within the Kimberley process and even outside the Kimberley process, there has been discussions on use of technology to try and determine if diamonds are from a particular conflict region. And I think it's something that the working group of diamond experts has been discussing over the years. Use of fingerprinting technologies, and also taking a footprint of diamonds from different regions, and that kind of repository of diamonds in a sense might help in certain situations. But I think they are still developing the technologies. I know at some point when I participated in a visit to a tour in Australia, at the University of Western Australia, there was discussion around developing a system for determining the origin of particular diamonds. But I think the experts know certain characteristics if they have the footprint of particular diamonds to such that if those diamonds are found in a particular parcel, they may be determined as originating from a particular region, which might be affected by conflict. So, but an expert is better to address this particular question. So there are experts within the Kimberley process who can competently and definitely be able to give a definitive answer on this. But I understand there are practical difficulties in determining that, just in addition to what Hans has said, when it comes to assuring the consumers. So the purpose of the certificate is to assure the consumer that these diamonds are conflict-free or are from a region which is conflict-free, and they are supposed to be, the origin of the diamonds is supposed to be indicated on the certificate as an assurance. But fake certificates come. Fraudulent certificates are a major problem within the Kimberley process when it comes to determining the origin of diamonds. And that's something that the KP in its different working groups is also looking at. So that would be my answer, but the experts would know better.
Okay, thank you so much. We have many questions, so yeah, let me translate that briefly. 簡単に、今の、回答を日本語にさせていただきますと、そのコンフリクトフリーが、の定義にまずよるという話なんですけれども、キンバリープロセスが定義する コンフリクトフリーという意味で良いのであれば、そのキンバリープロセスの証明書を、見せてもらうというのが一つの方法なんですけれども、そうではなくて、その人権侵害なども含めてコンフリクトフリーというふうに言いたい場合には、なかなかその証明書が出せる、というか見分けるというのは、現状では非常に困難ということで、欧米ですと例えばそのマイ・フェア・ダイヤモンドというブランドですとか、がそういったものを扱ったり、しています。またその原産地でいうと、オーストラリアとかカナダといったものが、今のところはそのコンフリクトフリーではないといったことで知られています。で、アフリカでももちろんその責任を持ってこう、採掘されている原石もあるとは思うんですけれども、なかなかその証明書を伴うものというのはないので、ちょっと現実的には難しいという、回答でした。So let's move on to the second question. Okay, what kind of capacity building and technical assistance is being provided? Does Japan also provide such cooperation and support among the participating countries?
Thanks. From our interactions in the Kimberley process, I think the Japanese delegation, to be honest, has not been very visible and active in the Kimberley process. But of course, they participate in some meetings. I'm saying this from the last KP annual report from Japan that we assessed. So our comment for them was that they need to start being active and exchange information and even provide technical assistance to other participants in the Kimberley process. So we did an assessment of Japanese annual report, and that was one of the reason why technical assistance and also providing support and information sharing is because the KP relies on voluntary certain activities of the KP definitely rely on voluntary contributions when it comes to technical support. So I think this is something that the Japanese government should be looking at. The KP emphasizes that participants in the Kimberley process should share information, should share knowledge, and where possible, technical expertise as part of cooperation, working together as a group, which involves governments and observers. Namely, in terms of observers, we are talking about the Civil Society Coalition and also the WDC, which represents industry. So, but the Japanese delegation has been participating in KP intersessional meetings and plenary meetings, but I definitely encourage them to do more in terms of being active in the KP.
Yeah, thank you.
If I can maybe add just one element is that, as I said, the KP doesn't have a budget of its own. So actually the only members, they just have to finance their own participation in meetings or review visits. But there is so far there's no fund where to finance such activities from. One of that was on the table actually in the last reform cycle is to create a multi-donor fund whereby all or participants who want could make voluntary contributions. And that fund the idea was that it could be used for technical assistance and capacity building. Discussions on this were not concluded during the reform cycle. They're not off the table, but they're a bit pushed towards the long term. So this discussion continues. And so issues that there's currently two regional approaches where some donors are financing some technical assistance, and that's in Western Africa, the Mano River Union. and in the Central Africa regional approach around the Central African Republic, but that last one still has to take off really. But technical assistance is often needed for many countries because this is a very complex sector. And then, for instance, one of the areas that is very hard and where there's a lack of skill often in many countries is valuation of diamonds. So put a price on a diamond to make sure that your country benefits what it should. And that is something where there's still serious shortcomings.
Thank you. 今の、質問に対する回答もちょっと簡単に、説明させていただきますと、どのようなキャパシティビルディングや技術支援が行われていますかということに対しては、あまり具体的な回答ではなかったんですけれども、最後のハンスさんの方から、西アフリカのマノリバーリージョン、ギニア、シエラレオネ、リベリアの3カ国に対しての技術支援が、これはGIZ というドイツの、開発公社が行っています。また中央アフリカに対しても、そのような、支援があるとのこと。ただそのキンバリープロセスというのはその予算を持たない組織であるために、こういった技術支援というものの、お金がないということで、マルチドナーファンドを作ろうという話も、あるそうですけれども、まだその議論が続いていて、決まっていないというようなお話でした。でまたその日本政府に関しては、もちろん日本の政府も3カ国ではあるんですけれども、あまりその存在がプレゼンスが見えないというか、あまりその積極的な印象ではないということで、日本政府にももっと積極的に関わってほしいということでした。では次の3つ目の質問に、行きたいと思います。KP はなぜダイヤモンド原石だけを対象としているのでしょうかということで、Why does Kimberley process only focus on rough diamonds? Not cut or polished?
Well, it's basically, it stems from the origins of the KP. So the KP was really designed to tackle these civil wars that were happening in African countries linked to the trade in rough diamonds. So that was the problem at the late 1990s, early 2000s that needed to be addressed. And that is why it was then decided to focus on rough diamonds. We have made the arguments, others have made the arguments that this situation has changed. The Kimberley process should expand also to polished diamonds, but so far, we're still actually, the Kimberley process design is still more or less the same as how it was devised 20 years ago. And that's mainly that would be the explanation.
Thank you. なぜ原石だけかという話なんですけれども、そのキンバリープロセスの設立の経緯ですね、これがそのアフリカでダイヤモンドが資金源となって内戦が行われたので、それをまず止めるというためにキンバリープロセスが設立されたので、アフリカといえばダイヤモンドの原石を採掘している国ということなので、原石だけになったということです。でやっぱりこの定義が狭いということに関しても、いろいろと訴えかけてはいるんですけれども、なかなかその定義は20年前から変わっていないということでした。ではちょっとお時間過ぎますが、もう少し、質問がたくさん来ていますので聞きたいと思います。じゃあ4つ目ですね、シエラレオネの環境犯罪について詳しく説明していただきたいです。ということで、Okay, the next question is I would like to know more about the environmental crimes in Sierra Leone. Are the armed forces destroying the environment for purpose, or does the conflict process involve environmental destruction?
In Sierra Leone, it is not the armed forces that are destroying the environment. It is the companies. We have a subsidiary of BSRG company there in one of the communities that has been implicated in environmental harm, displacement of communities, grabbing of land, and then also pollution and degradation of livelihood, pollution of water sources. So these are violations, or these are abuses being committed by the companies themselves, and not necessarily the armed forces.
Thank you. では今の回答ですけれども、その武装勢力ではないということですね。三味さんのプレゼンテーションにあったその環境犯罪というのは、その武装勢力によるものというよりは、環境破壊のことを、環境犯罪というふうに、書かれていました。で、シエラレオネの場合は、鉱山の会社がそういったことを、行っているということです。では次の質問に行かせていただきます。実際に被害に遭っている労働者の方からのコメントや印象的な言葉などがあれば教えていただきたいです。The next question is, I would like to hear any comments or memorable words from actual artisanal or any workers who have been affected or abused.
Yes, I think we often don't hear enough of these. This is a voice also that is not, communities or workers are not represented in the Kimberley process. There has been, and we mentioned the peer review system that has been expanded. We've tried to include a requirement for such a review visit in a country to also speak with communities, to speak with workers. That has not been accepted. So this is definitely something that is missing. One recommendation I could give if you want to hear more testimonies directly is I could refer to last week's symposium by the Chicago Responsible Jewelry Conference, where we had testimonies from affected communities in Zimbabwe and Lesotho, and these have been recorded. I don't think they are online yet, but they should come online soon. So I guess Chi will also distribute these in the Diamonds for Peace networks once these are out.
Okay, thank you. その現場からの声というのはなかなか少ないというのが現状でございまして、それがキンバリープロセスでも、一つの課題だというふうに捉えているということです。で、実際のその、コメントであるとか証言というのを、聞きたい方は先週ですね、シカゴリスポンシブルジュリーカンファレンスという団体がシンポジウムをオンラインで開催しまして、その録画がもうじき公開される予定ですので、そちらの方をご覧いただければと思いますということでした。で、その URL の方は公開されたら、今日ご参加の皆さんに、メールでお知らせしたいと思います。So the next one is the last one? I guess, yeah. Okay, so the next one is the last one we ask you tonight. So the 次の質問は、キンバリープロセスはダイヤモンドの国際取引に人道的な観点を与えた良い国際的な取り組みだと思いますが、同時に途上国の鉱物資源に基づく開発に支障をきたしてしまう可能性も、はらんでいると考えられます。この点について具体的にどのように取り組みがなされているのでしょうか。The Kimberley process is a good international initiative that gives a humanitarian perspective to the international trade in diamonds, but at the same time, it may hinder development based on the mineral resources of developing countries. What exactly is being done in this regard?
So within the Kimberley process, we have definitely raised a concern on the lack of focus on development issues and also the use of revenues from diamonds by the participating countries. So the Kimberley process is not concerned about how a country uses its resources for development, and also the issue of corruption, illicit trade, and apologies, not illicit trade, but the use of revenues by governments, the distribution of revenues from the diamond mining sector. So that topic has been sidelined to discussions at a certain level, For example, in the working group on alluvial and artisanal mining, that's where some discussions on diamonds and development happen, but it's not enough. Then there was also at some point discussions and adoption of what we call the Washington Declaration, which provided for the need to make sure that in artisanal and small-scale mining countries where diamonds are being generated, those diamonds also lead to development and improve the livelihoods of people. So the discussions on development within the Kimberley process are not as prominent as the issue of conflict diamonds and the issue of certification, as it were. And I think for us as the Civil Society Coalition, this is a discussion that should be top in terms of the agenda when it comes to development, especially in African countries. However, what I may also point out is that there's a certain institution that was created out of the efforts of some industry players and also some participants definitely helping in a way, which is called DDI, Diamonds for Development Initiative. And DDI has been pursuing that development trajectory and is an observer, independent observer in the Kimberley process. So DDI has been trying to promote the development angle. But like I indicated, development issues are not top of the agenda in terms of the Kimberley process. So it leaves the member countries themselves to make sure that they put in place systems and measures to enhance development at country level, and that diamonds are traded and result in alleviating poverty in many parts where this is happening. So maybe Hans can add.
No, I think you've been quite complete, Shamis. So the Kimberley process wants to introduce more language, for instance, on the sustainable development goals and issues, but so far this has mainly been focused on language rather than real measures taken. And it's indeed, as Shamis mentioned, DDI is a bit the arm that is responsible for that aspect of the KP.
Thank you. こちらも簡単に回答を日本語にさせていただきますと、その途上国の開発の部分ですね、これに関してはあんまりそのキンバリープロセスは重要視をしていないということで、その、生産国、採掘する国ですね、はもちろんそのダイヤモンドによる税収というのがあるわけですけれども、それをどのように使うのか、それを開発に使うのか、違うことに使うのかというのは各政府の決定に委ねられているので、特にそこには関与していないということですね。で、ワシントン宣言というのがあって、そこで労働者の生計向上なども謳われているそうですが、なかなかそういった取り組みはされていないということで、DDI という国際的な NGO がカナダにあるんですけれども、今そこが、シエラレオネで活動しているという、あんまりこの、ダイヤモンドの業界ではその、NGO 自体も非常に少ないですので、そういった取り組みは今のところはあまりされていないということになります。
はい。それではすみません、たくさんの、質問をいただいているんですけれども、ちょっともう時間もオーバーしてしまっているので、ちょっとこのあたりで質疑応答のセッションは終了とさせていただければと思います。時間の関係上、すべての質問に回答することができませんでしたが、多くのご質問いただきましてありがとうございました。こちらまだ回答しきれなかった質問に関しては、今回の登壇者の方に連絡してメールで回答いただいた後、皆様に別途ご連絡できればと考えています。それではここで簡単にダイヤモンド・フォー・ピースからのお知らせをさせていただきます。
はい、では、手短に、お知らせをちょっといくつかさせていただきたいと思います。現在、ダイヤモンド4ピースでは、愛でつながるダイヤモンドキャンペーンを実施しておりまして、愛でつながるダイヤモンドというのは、産出国が分かり、紛争やテロとは関係がないダイヤモンドのことと定義しているんですけれども、そういったダイヤモンドを持っている方の、ストーリーを募集しています。で、現在はそういった方はなかなか少ないかもしれないんですけれども、そのような方々のストーリーを、いろんな方に知っていただくことで、この問題に対する啓発というのを進めていきたいと思っています。で、投稿いただいた方には、プレゼントもありますので、ぜひ、ご参加いただければと思います。それから私どもの活動を応援してくださる、サポーターの方ですとか法人会員の方を募集しておりますので、ご興味がある方はぜひこのウェブサイトのサポーターのページをご覧ください。それから、活動を一緒に進めていくボランティアの方も、募集をしております。現在、翻訳ですとかイベントの企画開催、広報、事務作業や情報収集などで活動をいただける方を募集しています。特に、英語を使える方は大歓迎ですので、ぜひこちらのページもご覧いただければと思います。それからやはりこの問題を解決していくには、一人でも多くの方にこのダイヤモンドに関する課題やこの解決方法というのを知っていただく必要があると思っておりますので、ダイヤモンド4ピースが、学校ですとか、企業さんで、講義ですとか講演できる機会がありましたら、ぜひお声掛けいただきたいと思います。で、ご連絡の方はメールでこちらの方のメールアドレスにお寄せください。はい、以上が、私からのお知らせになります。
はい、ありがとうございます。最後にですね、第4回の最後の、オンラインセミナーのお知らせなんですけれども、最終回は11月7日土曜日朝9時からブロックチェーンを用いたダイヤモンドの責任ある調達の最前線と題して、エバーレッジャー社副社長のキャリー・ジョージさんをゲストスピーカーにお迎えしてご登壇いただく予定になっております。言語は英語ですが、今回と同じように日本語の字幕と通訳がありますので、お気軽にご参加いただければと思います。また、本日ご参加いただいた皆様には申し込みのリンクを別途、今チャットボックスに流しましたけれども、そちら別途メールとPTX のメッセージでもご案内させていただきたいと思いますので、もしお時間があってぜひこれを聞いてみたいという方はぜひご参加いただければと思います。ダイヤモンド4ピースではダイヤモンドが人道環境配慮の上採掘、カット、製造されることが当たり前の社会を目指してリベリアにおける採掘労働者への自立支援活動と日本国内外においてさまざまな啓発活動を実施しております。皆様引き続き、応援ご支援をよろしくお願いいたします。ぜひSNS アカウントをお持ちの方は当団体の Facebook、Instagram、LinkedIn、Twitter のフォローをお願いいただければと思います。それではこれでは第3回オンラインセミナーを終了いたします。冒頭にお伝えしました通り、ウェビナー退出後に現れるページから続行をクリックしますとアンケートページを開くことができますので、ぜひご協力をお願いいただければと思います。本日はご参加いただきましてありがとうございました。